Fireside Tailes for Wolfgang. Originally broadcast on GWC Productions' YouTube channel, Caps Media Television Channel 6 in Ventura on KPPQ LP Ventura at 104.1 FM, and on the KPPQ Podcast Network. Episodes can also be viewed on Pasadena Media, either on Spectrum Charter Channel 32 or on AT&T Uverse Channel 99. Fireside Tailes for Wolfgang. Episode 71. Greetings and salutations. I'm Hunter Ackerman, here to read some classic literature for you. Do you all know what a harmonium is? It's this funny little reed-based instrument. It sounds kind of like, it sounds something like an accordion, but not exactly. I bring that up because that was the name of a book of poetry by Wallace Stevens, and we've read some Wallace Stevens before on this show. Wallace Stevens was born in 1879, died in 1955. And in 1923, Wallace Stevens put out his first book of poetry called Harmonium, and it's the only one that's currently in public domain. Most of Harmonium's poems were published between 1914 and 1923 in various magazines, and then published as a collection in 1923. Bringing us up to date. So this poem is called The Wind Shifts, from the book Harmonium, published in 1923 by Wallace Stevens. The wind shifts. This is how the wind shifts, like the thoughts of an old human who still thinks eagerly and despairingly. The wind shifts like this, like a human without illusions, who still feels irrational things within her. The wind shifts like this, like humans approaching proudly, like humans approaching angrily. This is how the wind shifts, like a human, heavy and heavy, who does not care. This poem is Life is Motion by Wallace Stevens. In Oklahoma, Bonnie and Josie, dressed in calico, danced around a stump. They cried, "Ho-ya, ho-ah, wah!" celebrating the marriage of flesh and air. This poem is called The Snowman by Wallace Stevens. One must have a mind of winter to regard the frost in the boughs of the pine trees crusted with snow, and have been cold a long time to behold the junipers shagged with ice, the spruces rough in the distant glitter of the January sun, and not to think of any misery in the sound of the wind, in the sound of a few leaves, which is the sound of the land, full of the same wind that is blowing in the same bare place. For the listener who listens in the snow and nothing himself beholds nothing that is not there and the nothing that is. So, to bring us up to date through part 6 of Peter Pan, previously, Peter had saved Tiger Lily from the dreadful fate of drowning, and this made the Indians forever Peter's friends. Peter had tricked the pirates by imitating Hook's voice and told Smee and Starkey to untie Tiger Lily and let her go. Peter then toyed with Hook by saying that he, Peter, was Hook, and then a duel ensued. Hook swam for the boat when the tick-tock crocodile came for Hook, and this allowed Peter, Wendy, and the children to find various ways back home from Marooner's Rock. Part 6 opened with Tiger Lily and her tribe keeping watch over the home under the ground, because all were certain of an inevitable pirate attack. The children below were having their evening meal. Wendy, playing the part of the ever-dutiful mother, was trying her best to teach the boys some manners. The rule was that when there was a dispute, they must raise the right hand and say, "I complain of so-and-so." After dinner, Wendy sewed, and the happy boys played and danced, but none knew that this was to be their last night in the happy home under the ground, and their very last hour on the island. Meanwhile, they sang, they danced, they had an uproariously happy time, and then they all got into bed for Wendy's story, the story they loved best and that Peter hated most. Wendy's story was about a lady and a gentleman named Mr. and Mrs. Darling, who had 3 descendants and a faithful Newfoundland hound nurse called Nana. But the children flew away to Neverland, which made the parents very sad. As Wendy and the boys were discussing the story, and Wendy was describing the window still standing open for the children to fly back, Wendy, John, and Michael suddenly became very homesick. Wendy asked Peter to make the necessary arrangements for them to go home at once. Peter pretended not to care at all, but inside he was seething. However, Peter gave instructions to the Indians while he was above. The Lost Boys decided to tie up Wendy to keep her there. When Peter returned, he said that he would never keep a girl in Neverland against her will. Of course, Tinkerbell was delighted to hear that Wendy was leaving, but the Lost Boys were all so sad, and this inspired Wendy to invite them all to come with her. The boys jumped for joy, however, even though he said the boys can go, Peter absolutely refused to go with them. After Wendy and Peter said their awkward goodbyes, he told Tinkerbell to lead the way. As she did so, no one followed, because it was at this very minute that the pirates attacked. Peter seized his sword, and the lust of battle was in his eye. From the book by James M. Barrie, Part 7 of Peter Pan. Chapter 7, The Children Are Carried Off. The pirate attack had been a complete surprise. All the unwritten laws of warfare go like this. It is always the Indian who attacks first, and he does it just before the dawn. That this was the usual procedure was so well known to Hook, so that in disregarding it, he cannot be excused on the plea of ignorance. The Piccalillis, on their part, trusted implicitly and wrongly to Hook's honor. With that alertness of the senses, they knew that the pirates were on the island from the moment one of them trod on a dry stick. The brave Indians were found by the treacherous Hook. Around the brave Tiger Lily were a dozen of her stoutest warriors, and they suddenly saw the deceitful pirates bearing down upon them. Fell from their eyes then the film through which they had looked at victory. For them, the happy hunting grounds was now. They seized their weapons, and the air was torn with the war cry, but it was now too late. Ultimately, the tomahawk of the terrible and brave Panther cut a way through the pirates with Tiger Lily and a small remnant of the tribe. It was not the Indians Hook had come out to destroy. They were but the bees to be smoked so that he could get at the honey. It was Pan he wanted. Pan and Windy and their band, but chiefly Pan. Peter was such a small boy that one tends to wonder at the Hook's hatred of him. True, he had flung Hook's arm to the crocodile, but even this hardly accounts for his relentless hatred. The truth is that there was something about Peter which goaded the pirate captain to frenzy. It was not Peter Pan's courage. It was not his engaging appearance. We know quite well what it was. It was Peter's cockiness. The question now was how to get down the trees, or how to get his men down. Hook ran his greedy eyes over them, searching for the thinnest ones. The men wriggled uncomfortably, for they knew Hook would not hesitate to ram them down with poles if need be. In the meantime, what of the boys? The pandemonium above had ceased almost as suddenly as it arose, but they know that in the passing, it has determined their fate. Which side had won? The pirates, listening avidly at the mouths of the trees, heard the question put by every boy, and alas, they also heard Peter's answer. "If the Indians have won," he said, "they will beat the tom-tom. It is always their sign of victory." Now, Smee had found the tom-tom, and was at that moment sitting on it. "You'll never hear the tom-tom again," he muttered, but inaudibly, of course, for strict silence had been enjoined. To his amazement, Hook signed him to beat the tom-tom, and slowly there came to Smee an understanding of the dreadful wickedness of the order. Never, probably, had this simple man admired Hook so much. Twice, Smee beat upon the instrument, and then stopped to listen gleefully. "The tom-tom!" the miscreants heard Peter cry. "An Indian victory!" The doomed children answered with a cheer that was music to the treacherous pirates above, and almost immediately they repeated their goodbyes to Peter. This puzzled the pirates, but all their other feelings were swallowed by a base delight that the enemy were about to come up the trees. They smirked at each other and rubbed their hands. Rapidly and silently, Hook gave his orders. One man to each tree, and the others to arrange themselves in a line 2 yards apart. Chapter 8. Do you believe in fairies? The more quickly this horror is disposed of, the better. The first to emerge from his tree was Curly. He rose out of it into the arms of Checo, who flung him to Smee, who flung him to Starkey, who flung him to Bill Jukes, who flung him to Noodler, and so he was tossed from one to another till he fell at the feet of the dark pirate. All the boys were plucked from their trees in this ruthless manner, and several of them were in the air at a time, like bales of goods flung from hand to hand. A different treatment was accorded to Windy, who came last. With ironical politeness, Hook raised his hat to her, and, offering her his arm, escorted her to the spot where the others were being gagged. He did it with such an air, he was so frightfully distinguished that she was too fascinated to cry out. She was only a little girl. Perhaps it is telltale to divulge this, but for a moment, Hook entranced her. And we tell on her only because her slip led to strange results. She Had she haughtily unhanded him, and we should have loved to write that of her, she would have been hurled through the air like the others, and then Hook would probably not have been present at the tying of the children, and had he not been at the tying, he would not have discovered Slightly's secret. And without the secret, he could not presently have made his foul attempt on Peter's life. They were tied to prevent their flying away, doubled up with their knees close to their ears, and for the trussing of them, the dark pirate had cut a rope into 9 equal pieces. All went well until Slightly's turn came, when he was found to be like those irritating parcels that use up all the string in going around and leave no tags with which to tie a knot. In their rage, the pirates kicked him, just as you kick the parcel, though, in fairness, you should kick the string. And strange to say, it was Hook who told them to belay their violence. His lip was curled with malicious triumph, while his dogs were merely sweating because every time they tried to pack the unhappy lad tight in one part, he bulged out in another. Hook's mastermind had gone far beneath Slightly's surface, probing not for effects, but for causes. And his exultation showed that he had found them. Slightly, white to the gills, knew that Hook had guessed his secret, which was this, that no boy so blown out could use a tree wherein an average man would certainly stick. Poor Slightly, most wretched of all the children now, was in a panic about Peter and bitterly regretted what he had done. Madly addicted to the drinking of water when he was hot, he had swelled in consequence to his present girth, and instead of reducing himself to fit his tree, he had, unknown to the others, whittled his tree to make it fit him. Sufficient of this, Hook guessed to persuade him that Peter at last lay at his mercy, but no word of the dark design that now formed in the subterranean caverns of his mind crossed his lips. He merely signed that the captives were to be conveyed to the ship, and that he would be alone. How to convey them? Hunched up in their ropes, they might indeed be rolled downhill like barrels, but most of the way lie through a morass. Again, Hook's genius surmounted difficulties. He indicated that the little house must be used as a conveyance. The children were flung into it. 4 stout pirates raised it on their shoulders. The others fell in behind, and singing the hateful pirate chorus, the strange procession set off through the wood. I don't know whether any of the children were crying. If so, the singing drowned the sound. But as the little house disappeared into the forest, a brave though tiny jet of smoke issued from its chimney as if defying Hook. Hook saw it, and it did Peter a bad service. It dried up any trickle of pity for him that may have remained in the pirate's infuriated breast. The first thing he did on finding himself alone in the fast-falling night was to tiptoe to Slightly's tree and make sure that it provided him with a passage. Then, for long, he remained brooding, his hat of ill omen on the sward, so that any gentle breeze which had arisen might play refreshingly through his hair. Dark as were his thoughts, his blue eyes were as soft as the periwinkle. Intently he listened for any sound from the underground home, but all was as silent below as above. The house under the ground seemed to be but one more empty tenement in the void. Was that boy asleep? Or did he stand waiting at the foot of Slightly's tree with his dagger in hand? There was no way of knowing, save by going down. Hook let his cloak slip softly to the ground, and then, biting his lips till the blood stood on them, he stepped into the tree. He was a brave man, but for a moment, he had to stop there and wipe his brow, which was dripping like a candle. Then, silently, he let himself go into the unknown. He arrived unmolested at the foot of the shaft, and stood still again, biting at his breath, which had almost left him. As his eyes became accustomed to the dim light, various objects in the home under the trees took shape, but the only one on which his greedy gaze rested, long sought for and found at last, was the great bed. On the bed lay Peter, fast asleep. Unaware of the tragedy being enacted above, Peter had continued for a little time after the children had left to play gaily on his pipes. No doubt rather a forlorn attempt to prove to himself that he did not care. Then he decided not to take his medicine so as to grieve Windy. Then he lay down on the bed outside the coverlet to vex her still more, for she had always tucked them inside it, because you never know that you may not grow chilly at the turn of the night. Then he nearly cried. But it struck him how indignant she would be if he laughed instead. So he laughed a haughty laugh and fell asleep in the middle of it. Sometimes, though not often, he had dreams, and they were more painful than the dreams of other boys. For hours, he could not be separated from these dreams, though he wailed piteously in them. They had to do, I think, with the riddle of his existence. At such times it had been Windy's custom to take him out of bed and sit with him on her lap, soothing him in dear ways of her own invention, and when he grew calmer, to put him back to bed before he quite woke up, so that he should not know of the indignity to which she had subjected him. But on this occasion, he had fallen at once into a dreamless sleep. One arm dropped over the edge of the bed, one leg was arched, and the unfinished part of his laugh was stranded on his mouth, which was open, showing the little pearls. Thus defenseless, Hook found him. He stood silent at the foot of the tree, looking across the chamber at his enemy. Did no feeling of compassion disturb his somber breast? The man was not wholly evil. He loved flowers, I've been told, and sweet music. He was himself no mean performer on the harpsichord. And, let it be frankly admitted, the idyllic nature of the scene stirred him profoundly. Mastered by his better self, he would have returned reluctantly up the tree, but for one thing. What stayed him was Peter's impertinent appearance as he slept. The open mouth, the drooping arm, the arched knee, they were such a personification of cockiness as, taken together, will never again, one may hope, be presented to eyes so sensitive to their offensiveness. They steeled Hook's heart. If his rage had broken him into 100 pieces, every one of them would have disregarded the incident and lapped at the sleeper. Though a light from the one lamp shone dimly on the bed, Hook stood in darkness himself. At the first stealthy step forward, he recovered an obstacle, the door of Slightly's tree. It did not entirely fill the aperture, and he had been looking over it. Feeling for the catch, he found to his fury that it was low down beyond his reach. To his disordered brain, it seemed then that the irritating quality in Peter's face and figure visibly increased, and he rattled the door and flung himself against it. Was his enemy to escape him after all? But what was that? The red in his eye had caught sight of Peter's medicine, standing on a ledge within easy reach. He fathomed what it was straight away, and immediately knew that the sleeper was in his power. Lest he should be taken alive, Hook always carried about his person a dreadful drug, blended by himself of all the death-dealing rings that had come into his possession. These he had boiled down into a yellow liquid, quite unknown to science, which was probably the most virulent poison in existence. 5 drops of this he now added to Peter's cup. His hand shook, but it was in exultation rather than in shame. As he did it, he avoided glancing at the sleeper, but not lest pity should unnerve him, merely to avoid spilling. Then one long, gloating look he cast upon his victim, and, turning, wormed his way with difficulty up the tree. As he emerged at the top, he looked the very spirit of evil breaking from its hole. Donning his hat at its most rakish angle, he wound his cloak around him, holding one end in front as if to conceal his person from the night, of which it was the blackest part, and muttering strangely to himself, stole away through the trees. Peter slept on. The light guttered and went out, leaving the tenement in darkness, but still he slept. It must have been not less than 10 o'clock by the crocodile when he suddenly sat up in his bed, wakened by he knew not what. It was a soft, cautious tapping on the door of his tree. Soft and cautious, but in that stillness, it was sinister. Peter felt for his dagger till his hand gripped it. Then he spoke. "Who is that?" For long, there was no answer. Then, again, the knock. "Who are you?" No answer. He was thrilled, and he loved being thrilled. In 2 strides, he reached the door. Unlike Slightly's door, it filled the aperture so that he could not see beyond it, nor could the one knocking see him. "I won't open unless you speak," Peter cried. Then, at last, the visitor spoke in a lovely, bell-like voice.
"Let me in, Peter."
It was Tink. She flew in excitedly, her face flushed and her dress stained with mud. "What is it?"
"Oh, you could never guess,"
she cried, and offered him 3 guesses. "Out with it!" he shouted, and in one ungrammatical sentence, as long as the ribbons that conjurers pull from their mouths, she told of the capture of Wendy and the boys. Peter's heart bobbed up and down as he listened. Wendy, bound and on the pirate ship. She who loved everything to be just so. "I'll rescue her," he cried, leaping at his weapons. As he leapt, he thought of something he could do to please her. He could take his medicine. His hand closed on the fatal draft. "No!" shrieked Tinkerbell, who had heard Hook mutter about his deed as he sped through the forest. "Why not?"
"It's poisoned."
"Poisoned?" Who could have poisoned it?
Hook!
Don't be silly. How could a Hook have gotten down here? Alas, Tinkerbell could not explain this, for even she did not know the dark secret of Slightly's tree. Nevertheless, Hook's words had left no room for doubt. The cup was poisoned. Besides, said Peter, quite believing in himself, I never fell asleep. He raised the cup. No time for words now. Time for deeds. And with one of her lightning movements, Tink got between his lips and the draft and drained it to the dregs. Why, Tink! How dare you drink my medicine? But she did not answer. Already, she was reeling in the air. What is the matter with you? Cried Peter, suddenly afraid.
It was poisoned, Peter.
She told him softly.
And now, I'm going to be dead.
Oh, Tink, did you drink it to save me?
Yes.
But why, Tink? Her wings would scarcely carry her now. But in reply, she alighted on his shoulder and gave his nose a loving bite. She whispered in his ear,
You silly ass.
and then, tottering to her chamber, laid down on the bed. His head almost filled the fourth wall of her little room as he knelt near her in distress. Every moment her light was growing fainter, and he knew that if it went out, she would be no more. She liked his tears so much that she put out her beautiful finger and let them run over it. Her voice was so low that at first he could not make out what she said. Then he made it out. She was saying that she thought she could get well again if children believed in fairies. Peter flung out his arms. There were no children there, and it was nighttime. But he addressed all who might be dreaming of the Neverland, and who were therefore nearer to him than you would think. Boys and girls in their nighties, naked papooses in their baskets in the trees. Do you believe? He cried. Tink sat up in bed, almost briskly, to listen to her fate. She fancied she heard answers in the affirmative, and then again, she wasn't sure.
What do you think?
She asked Peter. If you believe, he shouted to them, clap your hands! Don't let Tink die! Many clapped. Some didn't. A few beasts hissed. The clapping stopped suddenly, as if countless mothers had rushed to their nurseries to see what on earth was happening. But already, Tink was saved. First her voice grew strong, then she popped out of bed, then she was flashing through the room, more merry and impudent than ever. She never thought of thanking those who believed, but she would have liked to get at the ones who hissed. And now, to rescue Wendy. The moon was riding in a cloudy heaven when Peter rose from his tree, begirt with weapons and wearing little else, to set upon his perilous quest. It was not such a night as he would have chosen. He had hoped to fly, keeping not far from the ground so that nothing unwanted should escape his eyes. But in that fitful light, to have flown low would have meant trailing his shadow through the trees, thus disturbing birds and acquainting a watchful foe that he was astir. There was no other course but to press forward in Indian fashion, at which, happily, he was an adept. But in what direction? for he could not be sure that the children had been taken to the ship. A light fall of snow had obliterated all footmarks, and a deathly silence pervaded the island, as if, for a space, nature stood still in horror of the recent carnage. He had taught the children something of the forest lore that he had himself learned from Tiger Lily and Tinkerbell, and knew that in their dire hour, they were not likely to forget it. Slightly, if he had an opportunity, would blaze the trees, for instance. Curly would drop seeds, and Wendy would leave her handkerchief at some important place. The morning was needed to search for such guidance, and he could not wait. The upper world had called him, but would give no help. The crocodile passed him, but not another living thing, not a sound, not a movement. And yet, he knew well that sudden death might be at the next tree, or stalking him from behind. He swore this terrible oath: Hook or me this time. Now he crawled forward like a snake, and again erect, he darted across a space on which the moonlight played, one finger on his lip and his dagger at the ready. He was frightfully happy. Chapter 14. The Pirate Ship. One green light, squinting over Kidd's Creek, which is near the mouth of the Pirate River, marked where the brig, the Jolly Roger, lay low in the water. A rakish-looking craft, foul to the hull. Every beam in her was detestable, like ground strewn with mangled feathers. She was the cannibal of the seas, and scarce needed that watchful eye, for she floated immune in the horror of her name. She was wrapped in the blanket of night, through which no sound from her could have reached the shore. There was little sound, and none agreeable, save the whir of the ship's sewing machine, at which Smee sat, ever industrious and obliging, the essence of the commonplace, pathetic Smee. I know not why he was so infinitely pathetic, unless it were because he was so pathetically unaware of it. But even strong men had to turn hastily from looking at him, and more than once on summer evenings he had touched the fount of Hook's tears and made it flow. Of this, as of almost everything else, Smee was quite unconscious. A few of the pirates leant over the bulwarks, drinking in the miasma of the night. Others sprawled by barrels over games of dice and cards, and the exhausted four who had carried the little house lay prone on the deck, where even in their sleep they rolled skillfully to this side or that out of Hook's reach, lest he should claw them mechanically in passing. Hook trod the deck in thought. Oh, unfathomable man, it was his hour of triumph. Peter had been removed forever from his path, and all the other boys were in the brig, about to walk the plank. It was his grimmest deed since the days when he had brought barbecue to heel. But there was no elation in his gait, which kept pace with the action of his somber mind. Hook was profoundly dejected. He was often thus when communing with himself on board ship in the quietude of the night. It was because he was so terribly alone. This inscrutable man never felt more alone than when surrounded by his dogs. They were socially inferior to him. Hook was not his true name. To reveal who he really was would even at this date set the country in a blaze, but as those who read between the lines must already have guessed, he had been at a famous public school, and its traditions still clung to him like garments, with which indeed they are largely concerned. Thus, it was offensive to him, even now, to board a ship in the same dress in which he grappled her, and he still adhered in his walk to the school's distinguished slouch. But, above all, he retained the passion for good form. Good form. However much he may have degenerated, he still knew that this is all that really matters. Far within him, he heard a creaking as of rusty portals, and through them came a stern tap, 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 like hammering in the night when one cannot sleep. "Have you been good form today?" was their eternal question. Fame. Fame, that glittering bauble, it is mine, he cried. "Is it quite good form to be distinguished at anything?" The tap, tap from his school replied. "I am the only man whom barbecue feared," he urged, and Flint feared barbecue. "Barbecue, Flint, what house?" came the cutting retort. Most disquieting reflection of all, was it not bad form to think about good form? His vitals were tortured by this problem. It was a claw within him, sharper than the iron one, and as it tore him, the perspiration dripped down his tallow countenance and streaked his doublet. Ofttimes he drew his sleeve across his face, but there was no damming of that trickle. Envy not Hook. There came to him a presentiment of his early dissolution. It was as if Peter's terrible oath had boarded the ship. Hook felt a gloomy desire to make his dying speech, lest presently there should be no time for it. "Better for Hook," he cried, "if he had had less ambition." It was in his darkest hours only that he referred to himself in the third person. "No little children to love me." Strange that he should think of this, which had never troubled him before. Perhaps the sewing machine brought it to his mind. For long he muttered to himself, staring at Smee, who was hemming placidly under the conviction that all children feared him. Feared him. Feared Smee. There was not a child on board the brig that night who did not already love him. He had said horrid things to them and hit them with the palm of his hand because he could not hit with his fist, but they had only clung to him the more. Michael had tried on his spectacles. To tell poor Smee that they thought him lovable, Hook itched to do it, but it seemed too brutal. Instead, he resolved this mystery in his mind. Why
do they find Smee lovable?
He pursued the problem like the sleuth-hound that he was.
If Smee was lovable, what was it that made him so?
A terrible answer suddenly presented itself.
Good form. Had the bosun good form without knowing it?
Which is the best form of all?
With a cry of rage, he raised his iron hand over Smee's head, but he did not tear. What arrested him was this reflection: to claw a man because he is good form. What would that be? Bad form.
The unhappy Hook was as impotent as he was damp, and he fell forward like a cut flower. His dogs, thinking him out of the way for a time, discipline instantly relaxed, and they broke into a bacchanalian dance which brought him to his feet at once, all traces of human weakness gone, as if a bucket of water had passed over him.
"Quiet, you scugs!" he cried, "or I'll cast anchor in you."
And at once the din was hushed.
Are all the children chained so that they cannot fly away?
Oi! Oi!
Then hoist them up.
The wretched prisoners were dragged from the hold, all except Windy, and ranged in line in front of him. For a time, he seemed unconscious of their presence. He lolled at his ease, humming, not unmelodiously, snatches of a rude song and fingering a pack of cards. Ever and anon, the light from his cigar gave a touch of color to his face.
"Now then, bullies," he said briskly, "6 of you will walk the plank tonight, but I have room for 2 cabin boys. Which of you is it to be?"
"Don't irritate him unnecessarily," had been Windy's instructions in the hold, so Toodles stepped forward politely. Toodles hated the idea of signing under such a man, but an instinct told him that it would be prudent to lay the responsibility on an absent person, and though a somewhat silly boy, he knew that mothers are always willing to be the buffer. So, Toodles explained prudently, "You see, sir, I don't think my mother would like me to be a pirate." "Would your mother like you to be a pirate, Slightly?" He winked at Slightly, who said mournfully, "I don't think so," as if he wished things had been otherwise. "Would your mother like you to be a pirate, twin?" "I don't think so," said the first twin, as clever as the other. "Nibs would—"
"Stow this gab," roared Hook, and the spokesmen were dragged back. "You boy," he said, addressing John, "you look as if you have a little pluck in you. Didst never want to be a pirate, my hearty?"
Now, John had sometimes experienced this hankering during maths prep, and he was struck by Hook's picking him out. "I once thought of calling myself Red-Handed Jack," he said diffidently.
"And a good name, too. We'll call you that here, bully, if you join."
"What do you think, Michael?" asked John. "What would you call me if I joined?" Michael demanded.
"Blackbeard Joe."
Michael was naturally impressed. "What do you think, John?" He wanted John to decide, and
John wanted him to decide.
Shall we still be respectful subjects of the king?
John inquired. Through Hook's teeth came the answer. You will have to swear. Down with the king. Perhaps John had not behaved very well so far, but he shone out now. Then I refuse, he cried, banging the barrel in front of Hook. And I refuse, cried Michael. Rule Britannia! Squeaked Curly. The infuriated pirates buffeted them in the mouth, and Hook roared out, That seals your doom! Bring up their mother! Get that plank ready! They were only boys, and they went white as they saw Jukes and Chaco preparing the fatal plank. But they tried to look brave when Wendy was brought up. No words of mine can tell you how Wendy despised those pirates. To the boys, there was at least some glamour in the pirate calling, but all that she saw was that the ship had not been tidied for years. There was not a porthole on the grimy glass of which you might not have written with your finger, Dirty Pig. And she had already written it on several. But as the boys gathered round her, she had no thought, of course, save for them. So, my beauty, said Hook, as if he spoke in syrup. You are to see your children walk the plank. Fine gentleman though he was, the intensity of his communings had soiled his ruff, and suddenly he knew she was gazing at it. With a hasty gesture, he tried to hide it, but he was too late. Are they to die? Asked Wendy with a look of such frightful contempt that he nearly fainted. They are, he snarled. Silence all, he called gloatingly, for a mother's last words to her children. At this moment, Wendy was grand. These are my last words, dear boys, she said firmly. I feel that I have a message to you from your real mothers. And it is this. We hope our sons will die like English gentlemen. Even the pirates were awed, and Toodles cried out hysterically, I'm gonna do what my mother hopes! What are you gonna do, Nibs? What my mother hopes? What are you gonna do, Twin? What my mother hopes! John, what are you— But Hook had found his voice again. Tie her up, he shouted. It was Smee who tied her to the mast. See here, honey, he whispered. It was Smee who tied her to the mast, and then whispered to her, See here, honey, he whispered. I'll save you if you promise to be my mother. But not even for Smee would she make such a promise. I would almost rather have no children at all, she said disdainfully. It is sad to know that not a boy was looking at her as Smee tied her to the mast. The eyes of all were on the plank, that last little walk they were about to take. They were no longer able to hope that they would walk it manfully, for the capacity to think had gone from them. They could only stare and shiver. Hook smiled on them with his teeth closed, and took a step toward Windy. His intention was to turn her face so that she should see the boys walking the plank one by one. But he never reached her. He never heard the cry of anguish he hoped to wring from her. He heard something else instead. It was the terrible tick, tick of the crocodile. They all heard it. Pirates, boys, Windies, and immediately every head was turned in one direction, not to the water whence the sound proceeded, but toward Hook. All knew that what was about to happen concerned him alone, and that from being actors, they were suddenly become spectators. Very frightful was it to see the change that came over him. It was as if he had been clipped at every joint. He fell in a little heap. The sound came steadily nearer, and in advance of it came this ghastly thought: the crocodile is about to board the ship. Even the iron claw hung inactive, as if knowing that it was no intrinsic part of what the attacking force wanted. Left so fearfully alone, any other man would have lain with his eyes shut where he fell, but the gigantic brain of Hook was still working, and under its guidance he crawled on the knees along the deck as far from the sound as he could go. The pirates respectfully cleared a passage for him, and it was only when he brought up against the bulwarks that he spoke. "Hide me!" he cried hoarsely. They gathered round him, all eyes averted from the thing that was coming aboard. They had no thought of fighting it. It was fate. Only when Hook was hidden from them did curiosity loosen the limbs of the boys so that they could rush to the ship's side to see the crocodile climbing it. Then they got the strangest surprise of the night of nights. For it was no crocodile that was coming to their aid. It was Peter. He signed to them not to give vent to any cry of admiration that might rouse suspicion. Then he went on ticking. End of part 7. God, I love that ending.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Fireside Tales for Wolfgang. You can view more of my work at Hunter's Acoustic Cabin. Directed by Hunter Ackerman. Produced by GWC Productions. In memory of Wolfgang Beastly. Originally broadcast on GWC Productions' YouTube channel, Caps Media Television Channel 6 in Ventura on KPPQ LP Ventura at 104.1 FM, and on the KPPQ Podcast Network. Episodes can also be viewed on Pasadena Media, either on Spectrum Charter Channel 32 or on AT&T UVerse Channel 99.